It began the way most tragedies do, quietly. A handcuff clicking shut, a name unspoken, a judgment already made. Late afternoon light poured across downtown Atlanta, the kind that turned glass towers into rivers of gold. It was the kind of light that could trick you into believing the world was softer than it really was. But the air that day wasn't soft. It was tight, stretched thin with tension, the kind you could feel in your chest before you ever saw why. That's where I was, standing in front of the federal building, coffee gone cold in my hand, when I first saw him. Marcus Reed. He didn't look like trouble. He didn't look like anything that deserved attention. Just a tall black man in a plain jacket, standing near the courthouse steps, checking his watch more than the people passing by. There was something about him, a stillness that didn't belong to this noisy city. The kind of stillness that comes from men who've seen too much and learned not to waste movement. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't speaking. He was just waiting. Waiting like someone who carried patience in his bones. And then came the sound. Boots. Officer Bradley Miller. You could always tell when he arrived, not by sight, but by sound. That heavy, confident rhythm of a man who believed the street belonged to him. His uniform crisp, sunglasses perched just low enough to let you see the smirk underneath. The kind of cop whose boots talked before he did. I'd seen him around before. The swagger, the watchful eyes, the kind of man who scanned faces like puzzles already solved. When his gaze found Marcus, something in him tightened. His shoulders straightened, and his hand went right to where every officer keeps authority, resting on the holster. He didn't start with a question. He started with a verdict. What are you doing here? Miller's voice carried over the plaza, sharp enough to slice through the hum of the city. You can't just stand around a federal building. This is loitering. Marcus turned slowly, meeting the man's eyes. His answer came steady, even. I'm waiting for someone. No apology. No panic. Just fact, spoken with the calm of someone who had nothing to prove. But calm is dangerous to men like Miller. To them, calm sounds like challenge. He stepped forward, closing the distance with the kind of authority that feeds on fear. The crowd hadn't gathered yet, but people were already watching from corners, the way people do when they sense something ugly brewing but aren't sure if it's their business. Don't get clever with me, Miller snapped. Waiting for who? Show me ID. Hands where I can see them. Marcus didn't argue. He lifted his hands slowly, deliberately. I have identification, he said. I'm not causing trouble. It should have ended there. A man waiting, a cop doing his job, a moment passing like a cloud. But some men don't want clouds to pass. They want storms. Miller's jaw clenched. He moved closer, too close. The air between them thickened. I said, this is loitering. The words came out like a sentence. And then came the shove. The sound echoed across the plaza, skin against stone, the metallic bite of handcuffs finding wrists that hadn't done a thing wrong. The crowd's noise broke into whispers. A woman gasped. Someone muttered, for standing there? Another voice answered, weary, don't get involved. That's the thing about injustice. It doesn't need permission. It just needs silence. And silence was what it got. Miller leaned in, his breath hot with triumph. Got yourself a problem, huh? Think you can play games outside a federal building? Marcus stayed still, his voice level. I told you, he said quietly. I'm waiting for someone. But Miller didn't hear words. He heard defiance. Yeah? What's in your pockets? Keep talking. Marcus didn't. His only movement was his eyes, a small flick past Miller's shoulder toward the street. It was nothing dramatic, just a look. But it said everything. Across the way, a black SUV idled at the curb. Its windows tinted, engine low, presence quiet but heavy. Two silhouettes sat inside, suits dark enough to drink the light. They weren't watching the building. They were watching him. Marcus saw them. Miller didn't. The officer was too busy writing his own story, one where he was the hero cleaning the streets. He barked orders, each one louder than the last. Turn out your pockets. You think I don't see what you're doing? What am I doing? Marcus asked, voice calm. That question cut deeper than any insult could, because it forced Miller to look at himself, and he didn't like what he saw. He grabbed the chain between the cuffs and yanked. Phones came up. Screens glowed. The city was watching now. A man in a tie whispered, "This is wrong." A woman in scrubs stopped walking, then didn't move at all. The plaza had gone still, the kind of stillness before something breaks. Across the street, one of the men in the SUV leaned forward, the light catching his profile. Square jaw, measured expression. the kind of look that belonged to someone trained to watch and wait. The driver lifted a hand to his earpiece. No door opened. No siren blared. Just attention, silent, unblinking, cold as glass. And still, Miller pressed on. He took out a notepad, his pen scratching like a blade carving lies into paper. Name: Marcus Reed. Spell it. The officer wrote it like he was engraving guilt. Reason for being here? I told you. I'm waiting for someone. For what purpose? To meet them. The simplicity of it, the unshakable calm, made Miller furious. Truth, plain and undressed, has a way of embarrassing arrogance. He muttered something about trespassing, about threats, about people like you. The SUV's engine hummed louder, or maybe that was my heartbeat. Because you could feel it now, the shift. The story was moving, and Miller didn't know it. He thought he held the center because he held the cuffs, but the center had moved. It was sitting in that black SUV with two pairs of patient eyes. A siren wailed somewhere distant. Not for this moment, but it might as well have been. Miller pushed Marcus toward the patrol car, one hand gripping the shoulder of a man who'd done nothing wrong. Look at me, he ordered, as if vision was something he owned. Marcus did, and what he gave him wasn't submission, it was reflection. A quiet, steady mirror. The kind that makes you see what you've become. Across the street, the SUV door cracked open, just an inch. A pause, then closed again. Whatever they were waiting for, it wasn't time yet. And in that pause, I realized what made this scene unbearable, the imbalance of noise and silence. Miller's voice filled the plaza. Marcus' quiet filled the world. He wasn't just enduring, he was outlasting. When Miller finally shoved him toward the car, the handcuffs flashed again in the fading sunlight. Phones followed. The crowd turned into a collection of frozen faces, half afraid, half ashamed. The SUV didn't move. Marcus glanced toward it once more, and for the first time, his eyes softened. Relief, small, private, but real. He knew he wasn't alone. Somewhere out there, the truth had witnesses. They called it loitering. But what I saw was waiting for justice to catch up. Miller didn't stop at arresting Marcus. He performed it. He marched him down the sidewalk like a trophy. A loiterer in front of a federal courthouse, he announced to the world. You think you belong here? His voice echoed off the walls, bouncing between buildings, reaching every ear within range. A couple of young men in hoodies laughed, nervous, not cruel. Others filmed, lenses hungry for spectacle. Most just looked away, pretending the scene wasn't unfolding 10 feet from their conscience. Silence became the crowd's decision. And in that silence, Marcus walked. His steps were measured, his shoulders steady, his face unreadable. He didn't resist. He didn't plead. He didn't even frown. That calm, that unbreakable calm, was heavier than any shout could have been. Because you could see it, even if you didn't wanna. One man shouting to prove control, and another standing still to expose how fragile that control really was. Ross, the younger officer, walked beside them, or rather, behind. You could tell he didn't belong to this kind of cruelty. His hands twitched at his sides. His jaw clenched. His eyes darted between Marcus and Miller, as if trying to find the line between right and wrong. He didn't speak, but his silence wasn't the same as the crowd's. His silence was conflict, a war under the skin. Across the street, the SUV remained motionless, its presence pulsing like a heartbeat no one could hear. Inside, one of the agents spoke quietly. If Miller knew who he just cuffed, the other replied, he wouldn't have dared. But the officer didn't know. He didn't see the weight of what he'd done. He just saw a man standing where he thought a man like that shouldn't. For Marcus, humiliation was nothing new. It carried a familiar taste, bitter, metallic, unforgettable. Years ago, he'd stood in another uniform, watching another black soldier get stripped of dignity by a superior officer. Same tone, same smirk, same injustice hiding behind authority. He remembered the sting of that moment, how it burned into his memory, not because of the cruelty itself, but because of what it taught him, that silence can be sharper than rage, that restraint can cut deeper than fists. So now, walking in cuffs, he carried that lesson like armor. Every insult Miller threw, every laugh from the sidelines, every phone raised to capture his humiliation, none of it touched him. Because he had learned the one truth that separates the strong from the loud. Dignity isn't a reaction, it's a decision. Miller yanked the chain of the cuffs again. enjoying the sound of metal scraping metal. "Where's your smart mouth now, huh?" Big man's quiet all of a sudden. Marcus turned his head slightly. His eyes, steady, unbroken, met Miller's. He said nothing, and that silence hit harder than any word could. It was the kind of silence that forced people to listen. A woman in the crowd whispered, "Why isn't he fighting back?" A man answered softly, "He doesn't have to." Even Ross felt it, that quiet strength that made Miller's noise seem desperate. Every step Marcus took exposed something in Miller, the fragility behind his bluster, the insecurity behind his authority. Ross knew it. The crowd knew it. Even the FBI agents watching knew it. Miller was unraveling, and he didn't even know it yet. The SUV stayed in place. Two pairs of eyes never blinking. They waited, watching, recording. The street had become a theater, and the roles were clear. Miller, the self-appointed hero. Marcus, the accused. Ross, the conscience. The crowd, the jury. And the FBI, silent judges, waiting for the truth to write its own verdict. By the time they reached the station doors, the tension was thick enough to taste. Miller gave one last tug on the cuffs, jerking Marcus forward. The crowd gasped. The SUV passenger leaned forward again, but didn't move. Not yet. That was the hardest part, the waiting. Everyone was waiting. The crowd for the next outrage. Ross for the courage to speak. The agents for the right time to intervene. And Marcus. Marcus was waiting for the truth to come walking through those same doors he was being dragged into. Because he knew it would. It always did. Just not fast enough. Asterisk. Camera pans upward. Gray stone walls of the precinct loom over them. The golden light fades, leaving only the cold hum of fluorescent bulbs inside. Asterisk. The show outside was over. But the real theater hadn't even begun. The air inside the precinct was nothing like the street. Out there, sunlight had at least tried to make the day look decent. In here, everything was gray, gray light, gray walls, gray souls who'd stopped noticing the color of right and wrong. The place smelled of burnt coffee, old dust, and the arrogance of men who thought paperwork could rewrite truth. Bradley Miller shoved Marcus Reed through the doorway like a prize catch. The handcuffs clanged against the arm of a plastic chair, echoing across the tiled floor. "Sit," Miller barked, boots hitting the ground like punctuation. Marcus sat, calm, hands cuffed, shoulders steady. He looked around once, not with fear, but with a slow, assessing gaze, the kind that measures the room and everyone in it. A man waiting, still. A man who'd learned that sometimes patience is the sharpest blade you can carry. Miller strutted toward the desk, chest out, adrenaline still humming from his performance on the street. He wanted an audience, and the precinct gave him one, half-interested faces, other cops pretending to work, but listening anyway. "Picked him up right outside the courthouse," Miller announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Suspicious behavior. Probably casing the place. Loitering at a federal building. Yeah, I got myself a good one today." He said it like a man bragging about a fish he hadn't really caught. Because deep down, he knew it, this wasn't duty. This was theater. At his desk, he flipped open a report form and began writing. The pen scratched like a wasp trapped in a jar. Suspect appeared nervous. He muttered under his breath as he wrote. Asterisk kept scanning the area. Reached into pockets repeatedly. Non-compliant. Resisted questioning. Possible threat. Asterisk. Lies. All of it. Each word a brick in the little fortress of falsehood he was building for himself. Ross stood a few feet away, arms crossed, trying to look invisible. He'd been there on the street. He'd seen what really happened. Marcus hadn't resisted, hadn't even raised his voice. And yet here was Miller, turning calm into suspicion, silence into guilt. Ross's jaw flexed, his stomach tightening with every word Miller wrote. But he said nothing. Fear has a sound, and in Ross it was the thudding of his heartbeat drowning out his conscience. Miller laughed to himself. "Look at him," he said, jerking his thumb toward Marcus. "Quiet as a mouse. And the quieter he is, the guiltier he looks. Silence is an admission, right?" Marcus didn't reply. He just folded his hands, the chain between his wrists glinting under the buzzing lights. The faint clink of metal was the only answer he gave. And somehow, that quietness stung worse than any insult. Miller wanted noise, wanted resistance. He wanted Marcus to lash out, to make the lie easier to sell. But Marcus refused to give him that. So Miller talked louder, trying to fill the silence that exposed him. Ross looked on, fighting the battle no one could see. Every instinct told him this was wrong, but hierarchy is a cage. He was new, still learning which truths were safe to speak. And right now, none of them felt safe. Then, down the hall, the rhythm of the room changed. A man in a dark suit walked past the row of desks. He wasn't wearing a badge, at least not one anyone could see. But authority clung to him like a second skin. He moved quietly. No swagger, no hurry, just presence. His tie sat perfect against a white shirt. His shoes didn't squeak, yet every officer seemed to hear them. When he turned his head, his gaze found Miller. Only for a second. A small, steady look. And that second was enough. The smirk on Miller's face faltered. For the first time, his posture loosened, his confidence cracked. Because some eyes don't need words. They carry judgment all on their own. The man in the suit didn't stop. He gave Miller that brief, measured stare, then continued down the hall and disappeared around the corner. No badge flashed, no name given, just the echo of authority lingering in the stale air. Ross caught it. He caught that look, that subtle message hanging behind it. And when he turned back to Marcus, he saw something he hadn't before. Recognition. It was small, just a flicker in Marcus's eyes, but it was there. A signal, maybe, or a reminder that the man who seemed powerless might not be as alone as he looked. Miller forced a laugh, trying to shake it off. What's he staring at? Probably some Fed looking for a real case, he said, too loud. Well, guess what? I just gave him one. But even as he said it, his hand trembled slightly. His pen scratched slower now. Because deep down, he'd felt it too. That chill that comes when you realize you might not be the biggest man in the room after all. Ross shifted his weight. He wanted to speak, to say this isn't right, to tell the truth that was clawing at his throat. But he didn't. He watched Marcus instead. Marcus hadn't moved. He sat like a stone in a river, letting the current rush around him, untouched. The longer the silence lasted, the louder it felt. It filled the room, pressed against the walls, wrapped around every line Miller tried to write. Across the squad room, phones rang, papers shuffled, life went on. But inside that small circle, Miller, Ross, and Marcus, time seemed to pause. Every second stretched thin, heavy with what hadn't yet been said. Then, somewhere behind the blinds of an office window, the man in the suit, Carter Hayes, stopped walking. He stood there, back to the glass, arms folded, listening to the sound of injustice scratching its signature into a report. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just waited, because men like him knew the rhythm of arrogance. They knew it always overplays its hand. Out in the open, Miller finished the last line of his fiction, signed his name with a flourish, and leaned back in his chair. He looked proud, like an artist admiring his own work. Only this art was made of lies. Ross felt sick. He caught Marcus's gaze again. There was no anger there, no plea for help. Just a question, silent but sharp. How long will you stand there pretending you don't see? Ross looked away. The weight of that question pressed on his chest until it hurt to breathe. Miller cracked another grin. Case closed, he said, tossing the pen onto the desk. Some days, justice really is easy. No one laughed. Even the air refused to join him. The fluorescent light above flickered, humming its disapproval. And in that hum, something began to change. Because arrogance never notices the moment the tide turns. It only realizes too late that the current has shifted. Ross didn't know it yet, but that flickering bulb above them wasn't just faulty wiring. It was the story warning him that darkness was about to meet light. Inside that stale precinct, 3 men sat in silence. One writing lies, one carrying truth, one deciding which side he belonged to. Outside, the world went on. Cars passing, sirens in the distance, the city exhaling. But here, in this gray room, history was rearranging itself one quiet heartbeat at a time. Carter Hayes paused by the blinds again. He could see Miller from where he stood, the smirk, the false confidence. And beside him, Marcus Reed. Still, calm, watching. Hayes's jaw tightened. He'd seen this before, in war zones, in interrogation rooms, in cities that ate their own morality for breakfast. Men like Miller always thought they were in control, right until the moment truth walked through their door wearing a badge they didn't recognize. He turned to leave, because soon, very soon, the waiting would be over. Back at the desk, Miller stretched, spinning slightly in his chair. Another fine day for law and order, he muttered, smug and satisfied. Ross didn't answer. He couldn't. Every lie on that report page was another nail hammered into the coffin of his conscience. Marcus shifted slightly, the chain of his cuffs brushing the plastic chair. That faint metallic sound drew both men's eyes, Miller's filled with irritation, Ross's with guilt. "You comfortable there, Reed?" Miller sneered. "Want me to get you a coffee while you wait to be processed?" Marcus raised his eyes, calm and unbroken. "I'm fine," he said softly. That tone, quiet, steady, certain, landed like a sermon in the middle of Miller's noise. It was grace under pressure, and it made the officer look smaller. For a long moment, no one spoke. The room felt heavier, like the air itself was holding its breath. Then somewhere down the hall, a door opened. Footsteps again, measured, deliberate, purposeful. 2 sets this time. The sound drew every gaze in the room. Miller glanced up, annoyance flickering across his face. He didn't know it yet, but those footsteps were carrying the first crack of his undoing. The precinct had its usual buzz that evening. Phones ringing, typewriters clacking, chairs squeaking in tired rhythm. But when the door opened, all that familiar noise collapsed into silence. 2 figures stepped inside. The kind of silence that follows wasn't fear. It was recognition, the kind that hangs in a room when power walks in without needing to announce itself. Agent Carter Hayes and Agent Sophia Grant, the FBI. They didn't have to flash badges. The air itself did that for them. Carter, tall and broad-shouldered, moved with the quiet certainty of a man who'd carried command before. Military, federal, moral, all at once. His presence straightened spines without words. Sophia, sharp-eyed and composed, followed at his shoulder, her gaze sweeping the room like a surgeon's scalpel, noting every detail, every face, every heartbeat out of rhythm. Together, they were gravity, and the precinct bowed toward it. At his desk, Officer Bradley Miller looked up from his report, still dripping with confidence. He mistook the silence for an audience. He leaned back in his chair, smirk curling at the edge of his mouth. "Perfect timing," he said, loud and lazy. "Got a suspect you'll want to see." Carter didn't answer. He simply crossed the floor, each step deliberate. The sound of his shoes on tile was slower than the pulse of the room. One beat, then another. He reached Miller's desk, didn't ask permission, and picked up the arrest report. The room held its breath. He read it, calm eyes scanning every word. The lies lined up like soldiers pretending to stand for truth. The silence stretched until you could hear the paper breathe. Then Miller chuckled. "You'll see everything's in order," he said. Picked him up for loitering right outside the courthouse. Guy was acting suspicious. Wouldn't answer questions. Kept looking around like he was about to make a move. Classic case. Carter's gaze didn't lift from the page. He didn't blink. Didn't react. His silence made the rest of the room smaller, colder. Finally, he lowered the report, slowly, carefully, and looked toward Marcus Reed, still cuffed to the chair near the wall. Their eyes met, and in that instant, the entire room changed temperature. Marcus didn't move. He didn't speak. But in his stillness was recognition, a shared understanding born somewhere far from this precinct, in places where men learned the meaning of endurance under fire. Sophia stepped forward, her heels clicking once, twice. She looked at Marcus too, and something in her expression softened. She knew that face, or the story behind it. A memory flickered behind her eyes, like recognition calling itself home. But she said nothing. The silence between them spoke the language of people who've both stood in storms. Miller mistook that silence for validation. "That's him," he said proudly. "The suspect I apprehended. Thought he could stand around a federal building like he owned the place. But I don't play games." His voice carried smugness like a bad perfume. Heavy, overconfident, reeking of pride. Then Carter spoke for the first time. His voice was calm, even, and deep enough to pull every wandering thought in the room back to the floor. "We'll be following this case very closely," he said. The words dropped like a stone into still water. The ripples moved through every desk, every officer, every heartbeat. Miller laughed, but the sound was thinner now. "Good. Glad to have the Bureau on board. We're all on the same side here." Carter didn't respond. He just closed the report, set it back down with quiet precision, and turned once more toward Marcus. The air thickened. You could feel the shift, subtle, silent, certain. For the first time since the arrest, the balance of power was changing hands, and only the attentive ones, Sophia, Ross, Marcus himself could sense it. Then Carter's gaze hardened, his jaw tightening just enough to show the weight behind his calm. Sophia watched him, waiting. She knew that look, the look he gave when truth was about to walk into the light. Marcus Reed, Carter said evenly, is not a suspect. Every sound in the precinct froze. The hum of machines, the shuffle of papers, even the air seemed to stop moving. He is a federal witness, Carter continued. The key witness in an ongoing corruption investigation. The words struck like lightning in a room full of dry kindling. No one moved. A pin slipped from someone's hand and clattered to the floor, too loud in the silence that followed. Miller blinked, his smirk dying by inches. What? He stammered. No, that's impossible. He was just standing there, loitering. That's all he was doing. Carter's reply was like steel sharpened in the cold. What you saw doesn't change who he is. Sophia stepped closer, each click of her heels another drumbeat of truth approaching its mark. Her voice was calm, precise, cutting. Do you realize what you've done, Officer Miller? She asked. You handcuffed the one man holding evidence strong enough to topple an entire network of corruption. You treated him like a criminal when he's the only thread keeping justice intact. Each word landed like a strike of glass breaking under pressure. Miller's confidence shattered. His mouth opened, then closed. He searched for something to stand on, but the ground beneath him had turned to air. That's ridiculous, he spat weakly. He's nobody, just some guy wandering around outside the courthouse. Carter looked at him, and this time, his voice softened, which somehow made it worse. You don't know him, Miller. He paused, letting the silence draw every ear toward him. Then, evenly. Years ago, when I served in uniform, Marcus Reed pulled me out of a firefight. I wouldn't be standing here if it weren't for him. And today, he's doing the same thing. Not for me. Not for you. For this country. The room tilted. You could feel it, that collective intake of breath, that invisible shift of respect from one man to another. Miller stumbled backward a step, eyes darting between Carter and Marcus. The smirk was gone. So was the swagger. All that remained was a small man drowning in the echo of his own arrogance. All eyes turned to Marcus. He sat still, cuffed, silent. But now the silence wasn't endurance, it was revelation. The light from the overhead fixture caught the chain at his wrists, turning it from a symbol of restraint into one of proof. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowered, not in defeat, but in release. When he spoke, his voice was low, but it filled the room like thunder rolling in from far away. Your prejudice, Marcus said, eyes locked on Miller, is more dangerous than the criminals you claim to fight. The words didn't shout. They didn't need to. Truth never yells. It simply stands. And the silence that followed was heavier than any applause could have been. Miller's lips parted, but nothing came. The arrogance that once filled the air had been replaced by something colder, shame. Carter broke the quiet. From this moment forward, he said, steady as stone, Marcus Reed is under federal protection. Any attempt to undermine him, to silence him, will be considered obstruction of justice. His gaze swept the room, pinning every officer in place. And we all know what that means. The words didn't echo, they sank. Miller swallowed hard, his throat tight, his pride collapsing in on itself. The swagger that had carried him for years was gone, leaving behind only the outline of what used to be a man in control. Marcus sat taller, even with the cuffs still on. He didn't need to gloat. His silence did that for him. The reversal was complete. Where Miller had dragged him in as a criminal, now the entire room saw who the real culprit was. Ross, standing near the corner, felt his heart twist in his chest. Shame burned hot and deep. He had stood there, said nothing, watched injustice wear a badge. And now he understood what Marcus's silence had been. Not surrender, but strength. The room didn't move for a long moment. It just breathed truth. Sophia stepped closer to Miller, her tone precise. Every second you kept him cuffed, every false word in your report. You were doing the work of the very corruption he's trying to expose. You weren't upholding the law, officer. You were burying it. Miller said nothing. His pen still sat on the desk, the last word he'd written, threat, frozen halfway through the page. Carter turned to Marcus. We'll fix this, he said quietly. Marcus shook his head slightly. You can't fix what was never broken, he replied. You can only face it. The line hung in the air, simple, unpolished, perfect. No one wrote it down, but everyone would remember it. Minutes passed. Maybe more. The room slowly came back to life. Papers rustled. Footsteps resumed. But the weight remained. The truth had entered the room, and no amount of noise could cover it again. Carter looked around, his voice cutting through the low murmur. For those of you who don't know, Marcus Reed has been working with us for months. He's been gathering evidence that connects local officials, business leaders, and law enforcement to a bribery scheme big enough to rot this city from the inside. He let that sink in. He was outside that courthouse waiting for a contact, a federal liaison set to deliver key files. If he hadn't been there, if he hadn't waited, this investigation might already be dead. The words landed like bricks. Ross looked down, realizing the weight of what he'd allowed to happen. Miller looked sick, shaking his head as if denial could erase what he'd done. "You expect me to believe this?" he said weakly. "He's no hero." Carter's eyes narrowed. "No," he said. "He's better than that. He's a man who kept his silence while you tried to strip him of dignity. And in doing so, he showed you exactly who you are." The silence that followed was surgical, cutting clean through the last of Miller's excuses. Sophia turned toward Ross now, her tone gentler. "You saw what happened out there," she said. "You know the truth. What you choose to do next will define the kind of officer you are." Ross nodded slowly, the weight of the moment sinking into his bones. He glanced at Marcus, the man he'd watched suffer, the man whose calm had revealed everyone else's fear. And in Marcus's gaze, he didn't see blame. He saw invitation to choose courage. Across the room, Miller's breath came shallow, his eyes unfocused. The world he'd built on noise and swagger had just collapsed under the quiet of truth. Marcus shifted slightly in his chair, the cuffs rattling softly. It was the only sound that mattered. Metal against skin, a reminder of what had been done and what would be undone. Carter moved to the center of the room, his voice now steady and final. "Let me make one thing clear," he said. "Today isn't about one bad arrest. It's about what happens when prejudice masquerades as law." He looked straight at Miller. "You thought you were enforcing order. What you were enforcing was ego. And ego doesn't serve justice. It suffocates it." Miller lowered his eyes. His pen had stopped shaking. His hands had gone still. Ross finally spoke, his voice quiet, almost uncertain, but alive. "I should have said something," he admitted. "I saw it all, and I stayed quiet." Marcus looked at him. "You speak now," he said gently. "Make it count." Ross swallowed hard, nodding once. Miller slumped into his chair, eyes vacant. Sophia's tone cut through the haze one last time. "Truth doesn't need to shout, Officer Miller. It just needs to stand long enough for lies to fall away." And then she looked at Marcus, not as a suspect, not even as a witness, but as something greater. A man who had carried silence like a banner, and in doing so, reminded everyone what strength really sounds like. The squad room fell still again. No one dared to speak. Somewhere outside, a siren wailed and faded, the city's heartbeat returning to its usual rhythm, unaware that something had shifted in one of its gray, forgotten corners. Carter turned toward the window. The evening light had faded to blue. He drew a long breath and said quietly, not to anyone in particular, but maybe to himself, "Sometimes justice doesn't walk in with sirens. Sometimes it walks in quietly, and when it does, the noise learns to listen." Marcus closed his eyes briefly, exhaling the kind of breath you take when the storm finally passes. There are moments when a room stops being a room, when four walls and a ceiling turn into a mirror, forcing every man inside to see himself for what he truly is. That's what the squad room had become. Not an office, not a workplace, a mirror. And for the first time in his career, Officer Bradley Miller didn't like the reflection. He sat there, still clinging to his clipboard like a shield, the words loitering, suspicious, non-compliant scrawled across the page in his own handwriting. Lies so loud that even silence couldn't drown them anymore. Across from him sat Marcus Reed, still cuffed, still motionless. The fluorescent lights hummed above, flickering just enough to make everything look unstable, as if the building itself was reconsidering what kind of truth it wanted to hold. The room buzzed softly with unease. Some officers shifted in their seats. Others avoided looking at Marcus entirely, pretending their computers suddenly required great attention. And yet no one could escape the gravity of what had been said. Marcus Reed was no suspect. He was the key witness. The man Miller had humiliated was the same man the Bureau had been protecting for months. The irony hung thick, heavier than the air, sharper than guilt. Carter Hayes stood by the desk, his badge gleaming faintly under the pale light. His voice was quiet, but the room listened the way a city listens to thunder rolling far away. "You nearly buried an investigation that could clean this department," he said. "All because you saw what you wanted to see." Miller didn't answer. He couldn't. Sophia Grant stood beside Carter, her expression cut from marble. She wasn't angry. Anger was too simple for this. Her gaze carried something colder. Precision. "You built your power on noise," she said evenly. "But the law doesn't live in noise. It lives in truth." And then, for the first time since she entered, she reached into her coat pocket and drew out a small silver device. A projector. Compact, unassuming. But in the hands of truth, even small things become heavy. Sophia set it on the desk, pressed a button. The lights dimmed. A hum filled the silence. Then the wall lit up, pale at first, then sharper, clearer, alive. There it was. The footage. The plaza. The courthouse steps. The sunlight bouncing off glass. The sound of a man's voice, Miller's voice, sharp, arrogant, unmistakable. "This is loitering. Turn around now." The video showed everything. Miller shoving Marcus against the wall. The metallic glint of cuffs. The crowd watching, uncertain and ashamed. Marcus silent, calm, unflinching. Every second of abuse recorded from the black SUV parked across the street. Every word, every breath, every insult. Miller's face drained of color. The other officers froze, their own reflections caught in the flicker of light. Ross stood near the wall, his heart pounding. He'd lived that moment once already. But seeing it played back, objective, undeniable, was different. This wasn't a story anymore. This was evidence. Sophia's voice cut through the air, cool and controlled. "We recorded the entire thing. Every word, every gesture, every misuse of authority. You wanted to write your version of the story, Officer Miller." She turned toward him slowly. "Now the truth has written it for you." The footage looped again, and that sound, the sharp click of the cuffs, echoed through the room like a verdict. Miller tried to speak. The words tripped over each other. Panicked, useless. I didn't." He was acting suspicious, I thought. But no one was listening anymore. The lie had lost its voice. Even the officers who had once nodded at Miller's swagger now stared at him with something close to contempt. Some lowered their eyes. Others didn't bother hiding their disgust. Ross looked at Marcus. The man's face was still. There was no triumph there, no vindication, only quiet, exhausted truth. The kind that doesn't celebrate. It just exists. Carter shut off the projector. The screen went black, but the image lingered in everyone's mind like a shadow burned into light. He turned to Miller. "Do you know what arrogance buys you, officer?" Carter asked softly. Miller didn't respond. "Exposure," Carter finished. The word hung in the air, final, merciless. Miller sank into his chair, staring at his own hands as if they belonged to someone else. The tremor in his fingers betrayed what his voice couldn't say. No more swagger. No more smirk. Just a man staring at the cost of his own ignorance. Ross inhaled slowly, as if surfacing from underwater. For hours, maybe for years, he had been silent. Watching, obeying, letting the system speak for him. But silence has a weight. And tonight, it was heavier than his badge. He took a step forward. The sound was small, just a shift of a boot on tile, but every head turned. Ross stopped beside Marcus. For a heartbeat, neither man spoke. Then Ross reached for the key on his belt. Metal touched metal. The room held its breath. Click. The first cuff opened. A faint circle of pale skin showed where steel had lived too long. Click. The second followed. The sound wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. That single, clean click was louder than every insult, every lie, every act of arrogance that had filled the day. Miller flinched. "Ross, what do you think you're—" "Enough," Ross said quietly. The word surprised even him. It wasn't shouted, but it carried weight, the kind of weight that comes from truth spoken by someone who's finally stopped being afraid. The room went still. Marcus flexed his wrists slowly, as if reacquainting himself with freedom. Then he rose. No grand gesture, no dramatic pose. Just a man standing, because standing is what the truth allows you to do. He met Ross's gaze, not as savior, not as enemy, but as equal. The look was simple, grateful, forgiving. "You spoke now," Marcus said softly. "Make it count." Ross nodded once, throat tight. Across the room, Carter watched in silence, pride glinting briefly in his eyes. Sophia exhaled, a slow, steady breath, the kind you take when you've finally seen something good grow from all the ruin. Miller sat frozen, unable to meet anyone's eyes. His pen rolled off the desk and tapped the floor once, the sound echoing like punctuation at the end of his career. No one moved to pick it up. Carter stepped closer, his tone calm but absolute. "Officer Bradley Miller," he said, "you are under internal investigation for abuse of authority and discriminatory conduct. Effective immediately, you are relieved of duty pending review." No applause followed. No satisfaction, no cheers. Just silence. Deep, solemn, deserved. Miller's jaw moved, but the words never came. Pride had finally met something stronger than itself. He slumped back, the edges of his uniform suddenly too big for the man inside it. The fluorescent light above flickered again, hesitating between shadow and exposure. Ross stood tall now, shoulders squared, the tremor in his hands replaced by resolve. He turned to Carter. "My report will reflect what actually happened," he said. "All of it." Carter nodded. "That's how it starts." Simple words, but they carried the quiet echo of something bigger, reform. Marcus turned toward Miller, who still sat small behind the desk. "I stood outside that building to protect something bigger than me," Marcus said quietly. "You chose to protect your pride." Miller didn't look up. Marcus studied him for a long moment. There was no anger left, just a tired kind of disappointment, the kind a teacher feels for a student who refused to learn until the final bell. Then Marcus turned away. He didn't take the report. He didn't look for a handshake. He just walked toward the door. Carter and Sophia followed a few paces behind, silent as guardians who didn't need to announce their role. The rest of the room remained still. A few officers straightened their posture, as if silently deciding what kind of cop they wanted to be when their shift ended. As Marcus reached the threshold, he paused. He didn't turn around. He didn't need to. But the room felt it anyway, that invisible wave of dignity passing through. The reminder that justice doesn't shout. It simply stands and waits for others to rise with it. He walked out. The door closed softly behind him, and the sound of it closing was cleaner than any gavel could ever be. Inside, Miller sat alone. The flicker above his desk pulsed, unsteady, as though even the light was judging him. He reached for the fallen pen, but missed. It lay there beside his boot, quiet as a verdict. Ross watched him for a moment, then turned back to the desk where the projector sat. He reached out and pressed the power button. The wall lit up once more. The plaza, the sunlight, the handcuffs. He watched the image for a second longer, then shut it off. The darkness that followed wasn't empty. It was cleaner somehow, like truth had rinsed the air. Carter looked toward Sophia. "You ever get tired of this?" he asked softly. She smiled faintly. "No," she said. "Because the day I do, it means I've stopped believing people can change." They walked toward the exit together. The night air met them like release, cool, calm, cleansing. Outside, the city breathed again. The black SUV waited at the curb, engine humming like a steady heartbeat. Marcus stood by the rear door, his silhouette outlined against the glow of streetlights. For a moment, he didn't move. He just breathed. The air smelled of rain, that kind of rain that hesitates at the edge of the sky, waiting to fall when no one's looking. Ross followed them to the doorway, watching. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The sight alone was enough to remind him of what truth looked like when it finally stood up for itself. Carter paused beside him. "You did the right thing," he said. Ross nodded. "Just wish I'd done it sooner." Carter's voice came low. "Sooner doesn't matter. What matters is now." Marcus turned his gaze toward the precinct one last time. Through the glass, he could see Miller sitting alone, the light above him flickering in and out like a heartbeat learning to fail. No anger crossed Marcus's face. Only calm, the kind that comes when the storm has spent all its noise. He opened the SUV door. Before stepping in, he looked at Ross. "Make sure the next report's right, too," he said quietly. Ross swallowed and nodded. "Yes, sir." Marcus gave him the faintest smile, small, private, enough to say you can do better now. Then he got in. The SUV door closed with a soft thud, the sound of finality. No handcuffs, no shouts, no ceremony, just closure. The vehicle pulled from the curb, blending into the slow stream of evening traffic. Red tail lights winked down the street, fading into the horizon. The precinct door swung shut behind Ross as he stepped out into the cooling air. He stood there for a while, staring at the road, listening to the soft hum of the city. Behind him, the fluorescent lights flickered once more, uncertain whether to burn or die. He didn't turn back. Some truths, once seen, don't let you look away. Night has a way of wiping chalk from the day's blackboard. You step outside and the city feels like it's taken a long, slow breath, tired, relieved, and a little ashamed of what it let happen while the sun was up. We came out of the precinct into air that smelled like rain, the kind that waits above a city, testing its own weight, deciding whether to fall. Behind us, the building glowed a sickly office yellow. In front of us, the street stretched long and simple, as if to say, asterisk, go on now. You've earned the quiet, asterisk. Marcus didn't rush. No one did. He paused at the top of the steps, wrists newly light, shoulders lowered a fraction, as if he'd set down a bag he'd been carrying for years. He looked out over the block the way a man looks out over a field after a brush fire, checking where the living begins again. Down at the curb idled the black SUV. It didn't look menacing anymore. Now it looked like a promise kept. Carter Hayes stood half a pace behind Marcus, hands in his pockets, a silhouette carved out of steadiness. Sophia Grant scanned the street with that careful, precise attention that says we don't celebrate yet, we secure the perimeter. And Officer Daniel Ross, well, he lingered at the threshold of the doorway, like a man who had finally stepped out of one version of himself and was waiting for his new shadow to catch up. No one said a word. Sometimes silence is the prayer you give the night when the day tried to break something sacred. A city bus sighed at the corner, brakes whispering. A radio burbled 2 blocks away. Somewhere in the distance, a train hummed low, like a good baritone you only hear when the wind tilts right. Marcus put a hand on the rail, felt the cool bite of metal. The same hands that had been wrapped in cuffs now touched the world bare. No rattle, no chain, just skin and night and simple freedom. He took the steps slowly. At the bottom, he stopped beside Carter, not to seek permission, not to ask direction, just to share the same square of air with a man who understood the price of carrying quiet through a storm. Carter spoke first, voice low enough to belong to the dark. It's done for tonight. Marcus nodded. Not triumph. Not gratitude. Something quieter. The kind of acknowledgement 2 men share when one has stood watch while the other stood trial without a judge. Sophia came up beside them, eyes still working the shadows. We'll get you to the safe house, she said. And we'll keep pressure where it needs to be. Marcus looked at her with that same calm that had kept the entire room honest. I know, he said. You already did. The door behind us opened and closed again, the building trying to pretend it wasn't changed by what it had held. Ross stepped out fully this time, leaving the frame of the doorway as if he and the threshold had finally finished their conversation. He approached like a man crossing a small river, not afraid, but careful where he put his feet. Sir, Ross said to Marcus, like the word wasn't rank but respect. My report will be the truth, not the version I'm supposed to hand in. The truth. Marcus studied him for a slow beat, not to measure the young man's courage. He'd already seen it, but to let the moment do its work. Make sure the next one is, too, Marcus said. That's how it holds. Ross swallowed, like the sentence had weight he wanted to carry well. Yes, sir. Carter nodded, the kind of nod that said, asterisk, start there. Keep going, asterisk. Sophia moved a half step back, giving room to a conversation that didn't need witnesses. The wind rolled through, nudged a receipt along the gutter, paper doing its stubborn little dance. Funny what the world chooses to move when everything important has already shifted. Marcus stepped toward the SUV. The rear door opened with a soft, ordinary sound, the kind that doesn't make headlines, just gets the job done. He paused, glanced up at the courthouse dome in the distance, and caught a fingernail of moon leaning low over the glass. Some men read maps on paper. Men like Marcus read them in their bones. He turned back to Ross one last time. When you write it, Marcus said, don't write around the silence. Put it in. Make them read it. Ross blinked. He'd never thought about silence as something you could write down, but then again, he'd never watched silence do what it did tonight. I will. Marcus got in. Interior light flared for a heartbeat. Clean lines, clean profile, a man outlined like ink. Then the door closed with a gentle thud. No chains, no ceremony, just a man seated in a car, finally allowed to rest. Carter and Sophia circled to their doors. Carter paused and glanced at Ross. "The right silence at the right time," he said, "is stronger than 1,000 accusations." Ross absorbed it like a man holds warm coffee on a cold morning. Carefully, grateful for the heat, unwilling to spill a drop. The SUV eased away from the curb, red tail lights slipping into the river of traffic until they were only another pair of eyes in the flow of night. We stood there for a while, not speaking. Sometimes you don't close a chapter, you let it cool. Ross looked back through the glass at the squad room. He could see Miller at his desk, small now in a world that had outgrown his kind of power. The light above him stuttered, unsure whether to burn or quit. Miller reached for a pen and missed. It lay there on the tile, quiet as a verdict that doesn't need to be read aloud. Sophia exhaled, shoulders settling a fraction, like a dancer after the last precise step. "You did what mattered," she told Ross. "No sugar, no pat on the back, just a line to hang tomorrow on." Carter checked the block one more time, eyes narrowing, then opened them wide as if to bring the city back into focus. "Justice is quieter than people think," he said. "No echo, just pressure on the right point until the wrong shape gives." It wasn't a speech. It was a sentence you keep on a shelf for when the room starts to tilt again. Ross nodded. He had work to do. Not the kind with applause at the end. The kind that sits on your desk at 2 a.m., dares you to cut out the lie, and asks whether you want to be the sort of man who signs his name under what he knows is true. He turned back to the door. "I'm going to start the report." "Start the change," Carter answered. Ross almost smiled. Almost. He went inside. The door took him. The light swallowed him up. Some buildings don't change. Some men do. And that's how a building learns. Sophia headed toward her car, heels clicking a metronome that kept the street honest. Carter lingered another moment, gaze on the far corner where the night gathered a little thicker than elsewhere. Then he followed Sophia into the dark like a man stepping back into a job that didn't end, just shifted shape. I stayed on the sidewalk, watching the block give up its corners. The last of the bus exhaust thinned. A single porch light flicked on in an upstairs window like a late promise kept. And that's when it occurred to me. Anger hadn't left. It had just found a seat it didn't have to share with violence. There's a difference between making the world pay for what it did and making the truth stand where everyone can see it. Tonight chose the second thing. Inside the SUV, the city slid by in glass and shadow. Marcus watched it the way a soldier watches a horizon he once walked across barefoot, respectful, wary, grateful to be moving without the need to run. Sophia drove. Her hands were steady, her eyes working the mirrors like chess pieces. Carter rode shotgun, not talking much. Sometimes leaders understand that silence is how you let other people breathe. After a while, Carter spoke without turning. "There'll be blowback." "There always is," Marcus said. "You sure you want to carry it tonight?" Marcus looked at his open hands, the faint pale bands where cuffs had been. "I was carrying it before tonight," he said. "Tonight, just let everybody see the shape." The SUV rolled past a diner with a neon sign that buzzed like a locust stuck in a jar. A couple sat by the window, hands touching across Formica. The ordinary has a way of breaking your heart in the best possible way when you've just walked out of a room where men try to rename you. Sophia's voice came soft, as if she didn't want to scuff the quiet. "If you need time." "Time doesn't fix it," Marcus answered gently. "Truth does." Carter nodded, almost to himself. "We'll have your statement recorded tomorrow," he said. "We'll move on the names once the files are confirmed." Marcus let the plan find its place in the car. He didn't reach for it. He let it settle, the way a river lets a stone decide where it's going to rest. They took the long route. Habit, protocol, muscle memory. You don't drive a witness straight to shelter after a day like this, not when pride has been bruised and dishonor is looking for somewhere to land. The SUV turned down a quieter street. Trees lined the sidewalk like old men who decided not to give up just yet. Carter glanced back. "You know," he said, "I almost said more in there." "Why didn't you?" Marcus asked. "Because some moments don't need speeches," Carter said. "They need witness." Marcus smiled. "Not the kind you show a camera. The private kind that belongs to men who have learned to bury glory and live with honor instead." "You chose right," he said. The safe house wasn't much to look at, which made it perfect. A porch light, a screen door, a welcome that didn't need to be spoken. Inside, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty, just undecorated. Sophia parked and killed the engine. Carter opened the rear door. Marcus stepped out, joints making that small music a body plays when it's told it can relax now. He looked at the house. He looked at the road. He looked at the sky, which had finally decided to keep its reign to itself. Get some rest, Sophia said, the words clean and simple. Tomorrow's the work, Carter added. Marcus nodded. He paused, hand on the frame of the car. Thank you, he said, not as debt, but as recognition. We'll be outside, Carter replied. I know, Marcus answered. He went in. The door closed softly, a kind of punctuation no judge writes, but every honest story deserves. Carter and Sophia took their places, one watching the street, the other the house. Guardians without ceremony. Sometimes that's the only medal anybody gets. Back at the precinct, the mirror of the squad room kept reflecting. Officers gathered in clumps of 2 and 3, voices low, faces long. Some argued with their eyes. Some apologized without words. A few sat down at their desks and wrote like men who had just found out that truth still paid a better pension than fear. Ross worked. He wrote what actually happened. He put the silence in the report like Marcus told him to. He typed the sentence the suspect did not resist, and then stopped, deleted suspect, and wrote man. He sat with that for a minute, understanding the difference. Then he kept going. At the other end of the room, Miller stared at his empty hands, as if wondering how something invisible could weigh so much. Another officer asked if he was okay. He nodded, but he wasn't. Arrogance is loud until it has to listen. The light above him flickered again. That's the thing about a bad bulb. Once it shows you its truth, it won't let you pretend. Ross finished the last line of the report. He didn't sign it right away. He read it aloud once in a whisper, the whole story in a voice only he could hear. Then he signed his name like someone laying a cornerstone. He stood, carried the pages to the inbox, and set them down the way you set down a weight you're not going to lift again. On his way back to his desk, he passed Miller. He didn't gloat. He didn't glare. He just said, "Good night," and meant it the way a man means I'm not walking this old road with you anymore. Miller didn't answer. Pride is a terrible roommate when silence moves in. Outside the safe house, the night settled. Carter checked his watch, then the street. Sophia took a slow lap around the block like a shepherd counting shadows. Across the city, elevators slept in their shafts, traffic lights changed for no one, and the late-shift janitors began their quiet liturgies of repair. Inside, Marcus didn't turn on many lights. He poured a glass of water and sat at a small wooden table, hands flat on either side of it. For a while he didn't drink. He just looked at the glass, the way some men look at a river they've finally reached. He could still feel the plastic chair under him, the stale air in the squad room, the echo of cuffs kissing bone. And behind it all, he could still hear a voice from years ago, the kind of voice that teaches you about humiliation when you're young enough to think honor is a medal you wear and not a weight you carry. He took one sip, then another. It tasted like the first honest thing that day. He stood, crossed to the small window, and parted the curtain with 2 fingers. Out on the street, Carter leaned against the SUV, watching the block with a patience that had nothing to prove. Sophia came up beside him, said something brief, and then listened to the night answer. Marcus let the curtain fall. He lay down on the small couch, not because he was comfortable, but because he was finally allowed to be still without paying for it. He closed his eyes. He didn't ask sleep to come. He told it the door was open. If you'd asked me what the city sounded like when it was over, I'd tell you this. Not cheering, not sirens, not victory drums. Just the even rhythm of steps leaving a place they never should have been forced to enter. The sound of a key turning the other way. The hush that follows when truth takes its seat and decides to stay. And somewhere in that hush, a young officer learned how to write silence into a report. A precinct learned the difference between authority and arrogance. A pair of agents remembered why they carry badges that weigh more in quiet than they ever do in noise. And a man named Marcus Reed. He remembered nothing he didn't already know. He just lived it again, without breaking. Because sometimes justice doesn't need to be loud. Sometimes it only needs to stand. And when it stands, the wrong things learn to tremble. That's how the day closed. No glass breaking, no lights blazing, no choir. Just a door that shut soft, a car that slipped into traffic like a thought you keep to yourself, a city that loosened its jaw and decided to keep going. Tomorrow would bring paperwork and statements, and the slow, patient gears of consequence. Tomorrow would ask for names and dates and signatures. Tomorrow would take its time. But tonight belonged to silence. The good kind. The kind a man wears like a clean shirt after a hard job. Out there in the dark, the truth lodged where it needed to be, working without applause, stubborn as a seed in winter soil. And if you need a single picture to carry with you from all of this, let it be this one. A young officer sliding a key into the small, bright mouth of a cuff. A hand opening like a dawn. A man rising to his feet not to conquer, but simply to stand. And the room, ashamed and relieved at once, learning what power really looks like when it finally tells the truth. That's where we leave it. Not at the courthouse steps where the day began, not in the squad room where the lies tried to live, but here, in the ordinary night that takes men home after they've done something worth carrying. Marcus didn't look back. He didn't need to. He left something behind that would do the looking for him. Justice, quieter than people think. No echo. Just pressure in the right place until the wrong shape gives. And in the morning, when the city woke up and put its shirt and tie back on, the report would be there. Ink dry, silence included, truth intact, ready to teach anyone who cared to read it what a man's calm can do when the world tries to rename him. Until then, there was only night. And it was enough.